If you didn't already know, this festival is organized by the Maine Consciousness Healing and Medicine Project, as well as Tours. And if you didn't also already know, there's events happening in this building all day, workshops, panels, and the like. And across the street at the McGoldrick Center, there's open to the public music, arts, all kinds of fun, and sound baths. Like I was over there just now and I'm feeling pretty good, so I hope you get a chance to check all that out. And later tonight there'll be a whole bunch of performances going on over there, including Hill of the Earth. And if you don't know who that is, look her up on Instagram. A couple other announcements. I have many sponsors to thank, but I just want to make sure that all of you are drinking water and washing your hands. Everybody? Okay. It's okay if you don't wear shoes. That one is fine. But just make sure you're drinking water and washing your hands. We have many sponsors, many of whom have tables outside, so please pay them a visit. I'm not going to name them all here because it would just be a lot of words and I don't think you get it. But I will take a moment to give special thanks to North Spore. They are doing a ton of work to advance mycology in Maine. Have a big round of applause. They do workshops, demos, they teach classes, and in one of my previous jobs I was teaching kids how to inoculate logs. They just sent me a bunch of sawdust spawn for free. That's the kind of caliber of people we're talking about here. So Northsport, totally awesome. Please check them out. Creative Norway is a non-profit supporting the arts in Norway, Maine, and if you don't know where Norway, Maine is, you should go check it out. They put on a yearly music and arts festival. They support classes and workshops, so Creative Norway, supporting the arts in Maine, and a great sponsor of this event. And then Sanctuary Sacred Mushroom Church. They have a big presence throughout this festival. They have a lounge space on the other side of the McGoldrick. They have a hall in Wish Camper, which is the building over here. You might have seen their flyers and everything. Their mission is to bring people together for healing and connection to divine revelation through communion with sacred mushrooms. So please visit them and check out what they do. There are a bunch of really cool food trucks behind the McGoldrick Center as well, so if you haven't eaten lunch yet, or maybe if you have and you want some second lunch, head over there and check them out. If you're hungry for dinner tonight, your options are basically those food trucks, local restaurants, and Sanctuary is putting on a dinner from 5 to 7 in Wish Camper. It's a ticketed event, but it's wholesome local food as well as community conversation. So that's, again, right next door. Feel free to check that out, and thanks to them. I think, yeah, right on perfect timing. Go Zach, yes. Gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dana Sawyer. He is a professor emeritus of philosophy and world religions at the Maine College of Art and Design, and author of biographies of both Aldous Huxley and Huston Smith. His primary expertise is in Hinduism and Buddhism, but for more than 20 years, his work is focused on comparative mysticism, theories of the perennial philosophy, and the spiritual value of psychedelic experiences. His essays have been published by the University of California at Berkeley, the State University of New York, the University of Muenster in Germany, and have appeared in such popular journals as Parabola, Yoga Journal, and Tricycle, the Buddhist Review. He is the author of Aldous Huxley, a biography focusing on Huxley's philosophical development, and most recently, the Perennial Philosophy Reloaded, which there's actually a copy of right here, but it doesn't come out for another month, so. But I hear it's online. Yeah, so you can check it out there. Please join me in welcoming Dana Sawyer.
I'm guessing this isn't the Rotary Club meeting I thought I was speaking at today. What an interesting group of people you are. I've never made so much freaking eye contact in 2 hours. In the real life, I see you. Quite wonderful, quite wonderful. I feel really honored to be with you today. I'm so used to speaking at academic conferences, and I was saying earlier today, the definition of an academic is somebody who thinks otherwise. So it's often confrontational, and I'm hoping for something more friendly today, might be a way to put it. I'm going to Oh, one thing that got left out of my bio is I'm a Mainer. I was born in Jonesport, Maine, and grew up in Washington County, so I'm always loving being home. And I'm talking today about Aldous Huxley and the Perennial Philosophy, and I'm doing that partially because this is the 70th anniversary of Aldous Huxley's landmark book. Oh, there's people up there too. Hi. I see you. And 70th anniversary of The Doors of Perception. How many people have read The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley? If you look around, you see that's probably 20% of that had their hands on it originally. So I'm going to be talking about it because in a book of 57 pages, Aldous Huxley gave his interpretation of psychedelic experience. And so I'll be talking about that. And let's start this way. How many of you have had an experience of feeling like you were one with ultimate reality? Look how many hands that is. A lot, right? A lot. Or a feeling of primary interconnectedness, that all things are interconnected on some way you can't perfectly describe, but you know it during the experience. Okay, more hands. I have to say I'm not surprised with this crowd. But, so it may have looked like this. You were on top of a mountain and you felt completely insignificant, faced with the stars at night or the mountains around you. And at the same time, you felt like this sense of transcendence and that there were no boundaries to what you were. Or maybe it felt more like this, and it wasn't an exterior triggered experience, but an internal experience that you had. Aldous Huxley referred to those moments as the unitive mystical experience or the unitive knowledge. He put epistemic value on it, that it was a kind of truth, a kind of experiential truth that you know directly, experientially, like you know love or you know beauty. You listen to music and you get it. How do we interpret such experiences? We have them, we know they're meaningful, but what the hell do they mean? How we interpret experiences is deeply, deeply important, because we can have an experience and place a value on it of insignificance or significance. Do you follow what I'm saying? So how we interpret it, our actions are based on our thinking. Our thinking has a lot to do with our worldview, how we see the world. And we internalize our worldview so deeply that it influences our thoughts and actions. An example I like to use of that is my wife and I spent a lot of time, years actually, in India. And one time we were in India and we were at a Thomas Cook and we had to cash in some traveler's checks. How many people remember traveler's checks? So we got this stack and we had to sign every one, you guys might remember. And we're standing in this line for our turn, and there's probably 12 people in line. But the problem in India, it's not a problem for them, but if you're a Westerner, it can be a problem, is they don't really wait in line the way that Westerners do. If you've spent time in India, it doesn't work like that at all. It's basically everybody in a gaggle in front of a ticket window proffering money is what happens. And if they are behaving themselves from a Western perspective, then if somebody's in a hurry, they'll just go out of line and go to the very front. And people don't really mind. It's just the way it's done there, right? So my wife and I were in this Thomas Cook line, and we're waiting our turn. And in front of us, there were these two punks. This is quite a long time ago. I mean, the real deal, right? The full-on, super glued mohawk, purple, lots of points, and he could run at you and finish you off. And he had on a jean jacket with no sleeves, and you know the getup I'm talking about, right? So anyway, he was in front of us, important to the story, because people kept coming from behind us to go to the front of the line. One of the guys got really tired of that. So he jumps out of line as somebody's coming, one of these Indians, and he's like, "What are you doing? It's not your turn, is it? Don't you know how to wait on cue? This is a cue. Can't you wait on cue? It's not your turn. Get back in line." And my wife turns to me, she goes, "Wow, that's the first time I've ever heard a punk handing out lessons in etiquette." Okay, well, this guy thought he was a cultural revolutionary, right? But he didn't realize how much of his own culture he had internalized around line waiting. So how we interpret an experience is influenced profoundly by our worldview. How do we interpret those unitive experiences that so many of you have had? In the dominant paradigm that you and I live in, the dominant cultural philosophical worldview of today, oh, you had a funny experience, you know? Don't make much of it. You'll fall into some kind of woo-woo thing, right? Or you yourself, based on the worldview you've internalized from your own culture, might say, "Oh, that was kind of weird," and just go on with your business. Conversely, Aldous Huxley said, those are profoundly, profoundly important experiences. They're unusual maybe in an individual's life, but they happen quite often to people. And what would happen if you lived in a culture where they interpreted those experiences differently? Right? So Aldous Huxley himself interpreted them differently. Here's Aldous, enjoying a cigarette, I see. When I wrote his biography 22 years ago now, his wife, Laura, wouldn't let me use this image on the cover of the book because of this cigarette. She thought maybe it would encourage young people to smoke. And so all the publisher did was just zoom in so close to his face that you couldn't see the cigarette anymore. And the reason that I wrote that biography, by the way, is that people were forgetting about Aldous Huxley. I would bring his name up in my philosophy and religion classes at the Maine College of Art, and nope, heard of Plato, heard of Kant, but I don't know who Aldous Huxley was. And yet they would often come up to me afterwards and say, "Hey, who said that?" I remember once I was reading a quote by Huxley where he said, "Too often in our society, the acceleration of progress is only a progress of acceleration. We keep going faster and faster and faster, but we have no idea where we're trying to go." And so students would come up, and want to write that down. And I thought, well, maybe it's time to write about Aldous Huxley. I took the manuscript, several copies of it, one copy of it to Kinko's to have several copies made. And the young man at the counter said to me, "I'll have these ready for you on Friday, Mr. Huxley." Because it said Aldous Huxley on the cover of the manuscript. And I said, no, I'm not Aldous Huxley. So then I knew, right, okay, time to write about Aldous. One thing to say here is in the middle of the last century, it's hard for a lot of people to understand how influential a public intellectual Aldous Huxley was. He published 50 books in his lifetime. People often remember him as the novelist who wrote Brave New World. How many people have heard of that book? I'm curious. Oh, wow, okay, great. But he wrote only 11 novels. Almost all of his books were about the human condition and how to improve it. And this is a person whose IQ was estimated at over 200, who had an encyclopedic memory. In fact, part of the reason for that was that he was once asked to review the Encyclopedia Britannica's new edition. So he read the whole thing and remembered it. His local neighbors in Los Angeles were people like Edwin Hubble, Igor Stravinsky, and instead of looking things up in the encyclopedia, they'd just call up Aldous. Hey Aldous, what's the origin of scissors? You know, oh, okay, S, okay. Extraordinary. In 1960, when MIT down in Cambridge had its 100th centenary, they brought in Aldous Huxley as a visiting professor that fall to help them find a vision for their next century. That's how influential he was. When he was giving his lectures on Tuesday nights in Kresge Auditorium, every Tuesday night the cops complained because he created gridlock in all of the Boston area. People would come to the hall. The first 3 lectures he had to give standing on stage with hundreds of people standing on the stage with him. So many people had come. So very, very amazing mind. And I'm going to share some of that mind with you today. Doors of Perception was one of those books, right? Trying to help the human condition. But it was based on a book from 8 years earlier called The Perennial Philosophy. And Aldous wrote The Perennial Philosophy in 1945 because he had become interested in mystical experiences. Several of his friends, like Igor Stravinsky, were artists, and they were always talking about these extraordinary experiences they had. So Aldous, as a project, said, okay, I'm going to read all the world's mystical literature I could get my hands on, and I'm going to write a book that's an analysis of it. And basically what he came up with was that this unitive mystical experience, and sometimes I'll probably just call it a UME, those experiences you had of unity or interconnectedness with all things, including you, are very common across the mystical traditions. If you look at the religious traditions, Aldous said, we find a lot of difference, right? If we look at religions, let's use this word, exoterically, the outer part of them, so their rituals, their music, their architecture, that aspect of religion, then we find tremendous difference, even in ideas, right? That Buddhists, for instance, don't believe there's a creator God at all. They don't believe in a creator God. Well, that's not the same thing as Judeo-Christian tradition, which believes there is a creator God. So on the exoteric level of the religions, tremendous difference. But Huxley said if we look at their experiential branch, and we look at what the mystics had to say, we see something moving toward parity. If you look at what Shankara in Hinduism says, or Shantideva in the Buddhist tradition, or Meister Eckhart in the Christian tradition, Teresa of Avila, they start to say things that sound very similar to each other, okay? I wrote a biography of Huston Smith, and Huston used to say to me, well, you know, Dana, religion is like pants. Plural at the bottom, singular at the top. And Huston used to say, at my age, I only want to talk about the waistband. So this idea that the religions, in a sense, converge in the mystical traditions. And how do they converge? Huxley says it tends to be around this unitive mystical experience. And he said, this is my minimum working hypothesis of what those mystical traditions have in common. So I'm sharing that with you briefly. 4 points. One, that transcendental to the world of appearance, matter, time and space writ large, transcendental to them, there is what the mystics often call the ground of being. that there is a ground of being that has no form. It's not subject to time and space. It's like a quantum soup. And out of this nothing, everything arises. That it is being itself underlying the ontology of all existence. So that's one claim of the mystics, that there's a reality beyond the apparent one. Two, that the apparent one is not separate from that. It is an expression of that transcendent ground of being, with no firewall between the two. And you are one of those things that's in this world, apparent world. You also are lifting up out of this ground of being. So think of it as, to use an analogy, an ocean, one ocean, but on the surface of the ocean there are many, many waves. So there's a multiplicity of waves percolating and bubbling on the surface of one ocean. You get the analogy? So you're a wave, I'm a wave. We're waves on the surface of this ground of being, lifting nanosecond to nanosecond into existence. And here's the one that really matters, number 3. Huxley said the mystics seem to be arguing. The mystics seem, there's a bunch of my old students in the Maine College Bar here every day, so it's an old home week for me. We can go from thinking about that as a concept, which we're doing right now, to experiencing that. That the mystics are saying, not only can you experience yourself as a wave on the surface of the ocean, which most people do all the time, but they have the capacity to experience their oceanness. You see where I'm going? Where Huxley was going? That deep in the core of your being is not separate from the core of all being. The great mystic Jalaluddin Rumi used to say, you are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. So you're an expression of this ground of being that William James, the great philosopher down at Harvard, he started the psych department at Harvard. He used to call it the mother sea of consciousness, that transcendental to your individual moment of consciousness is consciousness itself. So that is a profound, profound idea, is it not? Because basically what the mystics were saying is your brain does not generate your consciousness. Consciousness exceeds your brain. So your brain is operating more like a reduction valve of consciousness. It's taking all consciousness at a cosmic scale and contextualizing it in a wave on the surface of the ocean of consciousness. So in the way that a radio does not create the programming you hear through the radio, but is an apparatus for tuning in the programming beyond itself, that's what your brain does. Now, what's very interesting to me, just as a footnote to stick in here, is neurophysiologists that I've met at conferences. Edward Kelly, who ran the Consciousness Studies program at the University of Virginia's School of Medicine for decades and decades. Marjorie Willicoat, I won't bore you with all these names. Paul McCartney once told me that it's not good to name drop. I like that joke. Edward Kelly one time was explaining to me, and I'm not a neurophysiologist, but he was saying if you look at the neurophysiological science, then this other alternative way of understanding how consciousness works makes at least as much sense, and quite frankly, relative to a lot of phenomena we experience, more sense. So Huxley was saying back in 1945, wow, these mystics seem to have found a way to stumble into this experience of themselves as ocean as well as wave. Anyway, that was all theory, complete theory. Huxley was speaking philosophically about this. This is in my head, so I have to tell it to you so it'll get out of my head. I was reading a New Yorker one time, New Yorker, and I only read the cartoons. Anybody else guilty of that? So that guy, thanks. And one of the cartoons was a yogi in the Himalayas sitting out in front of his cave with his little son, who he was training in yoga. And he said, "Son, someday all of this will be you." So there's the idea, right? That I'm going to help you tune in to the fact that you're intimately connected with this whole phenomenon. But it was only theory to Aldous Huxley. Just recently somebody said to me, "May the 4th be with you," on May the 4th. Well, on May the 4th, 1953, Aldous Huxley took 4/10 of a gram of mescaline. This is the cover of the Perennial Philosophy. This is the mystical traditions converging. And Huxley called it the highest common factor of, it looks like he's saying the highest common factor of religion. He didn't say that. He said the highest common factor of the mystical traditions specifically. The religions, he believed, should be free to make up their own mind on what their individual highest principle was. Okay, we did Rumi. I'm being bad. I have to stick this in here because I think it's important. In 1946, Erwin Schrödinger, the quantum physicist who won the Nobel Prize in 1933, wrote in his book, Was ist Leben, What is Life, that everything he wrote in that book on quantum theory agreed perfectly with Aldous's description in the Perennial Philosophy. And here we have Schrödinger also smoking a cigarette. That's a theme today, I guess. The total number of minds in the universe is one. In fact, consciousness is a singularity phasing within all beings. So Huxley took that as okay, Not everybody thinks I'm spewing woo-woo, right? I'm getting a little bit of cred here. Huxley believed it creates a kind of overview effect. This is the benefit of the experience. Not just that it's groovy or that it creates a sense of tremendous individual freedom, which it most certainly does create a sense of individual freedom. In fact, I think a lot of the reason there's so much joy I'm seeing today here is that mental freedom people have felt from having unitive mystical experiences or spiritual experiences. And I put this slide in here because you may or may not know that when astronauts come back from space, they very often report that seeing our planet in front of them gives them this feeling of expansion and an overview effect that sets their life into a very fresh context of, things I thought I was taking too seriously. I've got to stop that. I've got to see the big picture. So this big picture part is what came over to Huxley on May the 4th, 1953. This is actually a picture of Aldous tripping that day outside of his home. He, excuse me, I have to turn my page here. Okay, Huxley wrote that day, well, his wife was tape recording him, and he said several times, "This is how one ought to see how things really are." And he describes the doors of perception, and I encourage you to read it sometime. He talks about having this unitive knowledge this direct experience of reality. And he felt like this experience of my interconnectedness with all life, so real that I can't deny it. If I deny the reality of this experience, Huxley said, when I'm in my everyday mind, why am I not denying that experience? Why do I think that this experience is real when that experience, you follow me, the unitive mystical experience, actually feels more real? He felt like consciousness, too many people think, is a fixed commodity. I'm either awake or I'm not awake. I'm either conscious or I'm not conscious. I'm conscious, I fall asleep, I'm not conscious. But that consciousness is a variable. That consciousness can be increased or expanded or made more authentic. So most people think of consciousness like a light switch that can be turned on and off. But Huxley is arguing it's more like a rheostat, like a dimmer switch. You can have your consciousness on and you can have it up. It can be richer, is a way to put it. Again, more expanded. And he felt like he had had that experience in spades that day. So he shared that experience in this book, The Doors of Perception again. And he got the title because William Blake said, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. Huxley agreed to that in spades, that human beings tend to be far more robotic and conditioned than they realize. I said last year when I was giving a talk here at Fungi Fest, we commonly are more like high-functioning sleepwalkers than we realize that we are. So he felt like, wow, I had an opportunity to get out of my default mode network, shake myself loose, and open back up to almost like a childlike mind of wonder and direct experience. The guy that gave him the stuff that day was this man, Humphrey Osmond. And Humphrey Osmond was a British psychiatrist working in Saskatchewan. And he wrote a letter to Huxley because Huxley had written this book about mystical experience. And he said, you know, a lot of my patients who I'm working with this drug called mescaline, and a lot of my patients are reporting what sound like mystical experiences. What do you think? And Aldous wrote back and said, wow, they do sound like mystical experiences, but I'd know better if I tried it. So Osmond came to Los Angeles, and he was terrified he'd be the person that drove the famous Aldous Huxley crazy. But he said, let's go for it, and gave him the 0.4 of a gram. And unbelievably significant event historically in the history of psychedelic studies. First of all, because they coined the term psychedelic, right? That's how it came into the lexicon. The word previously, well, there were several, but hallucinogens was the word. And Huxley said, I didn't hallucinate at all that day. Maybe I saw the curtains moving around a little bit. The curtains were breathing, but I wasn't hallucinating. He said, I felt like it was profoundly real, not a hallucination. So they started saying, we got to push back against this term hallucinogen. And they started making suggestions of what they might come up with. And Osmond said to Huxley, how about this? To fathom hell or soar angelic, try a pinch of psychedelic. And Huxley said, good choice. That's the one. That's what we want. Psychedelic means mind opening. And Huxley said, maybe sometimes people do have a psychotic experience on these substances, but not always. There's a range. He said, I didn't feel like I was in an insane state of mind. I felt like I was in a super sane state of mind. So mind-opening fit. And you see why? Because it's saying the mind gets open, but I'm not going to tell you which direction it is necessarily going to go in. That was a big step. And the next one, moving along quickly, was that in psychology, the common interpretation of psychedelic experience was as psychotomimetic, mimicking psychosis. So when you're in tripping, you're experiencing psychosis. Well, Huxley didn't like that either. Again, he felt like he was experiencing a super sane state. So he said sometimes it's mysticotomimetic, mimicking mystical experience. And together, very important historically, they set off the entire first wave of interest in psychedelics as tools of self-actualization. No doubt about that. That is how it happened. Because as Huxley and Osmond started writing about psychedelics in this way, a whole cadre of psychologists, therapists, philosophers, scholars of religious studies started getting on board with this interpretation of unitive mystical experience and writing about it and publishing about it. And very quickly, that first wave of enthusiasm bled out of academia, specifically into the youth culture. So now we're talking about the 1960s, right? And when it bled over into the youth culture with such tremendous enthusiasm, a lot of scholars started pushing back against them and saying, hey, you think somebody can just take a pill and have a profound mystical or spiritual experience? You know, the mystics meditated for decades and decades. They fasted. They did all these different sadhanas or spiritual practices, yogas. And Huxley embraced the concept of what he called, sorry, I'm going to come off that one for a second. No, I'm not. Causal indifference. And what causal indifference means is it doesn't matter how the awakening into the unitive mystical state occurs. If it occurs, if it works, it works. You follow what I'm saying? That if it's indistinguishable, this experience that a person is having on psychedelics, from what the mystics reported, then how they got to the experience is incidental. Plus, the yogi is changing their physiology through their practice. So if the chemical changed the physiology, it still just changed physiology. Houston Smith used to point out that the great German mystic Jacob Bohm, he claimed one time he was looking into a pewter bowl and he understood how the entire universe is configured. He saw the sunlight reflected in a pewter bowl, and he had this experience of his oneness with all reality. Well, should I pass out pewter bowls today? Is that the tool for triggering these experiences? Teresa of Avila had some of her most profound mystical experiences when she was near death, suffering from disease. Should we recommend disease as a trigger for mystical awakening? Huxley felt like, no, if it works, it works, and these substances can reliably trigger a unitive mystical experience. How you doing out there? Okay, all right. Thank you. So Huxley died in 1963. He died the day that John Kennedy was shot, was assassinated, same day. I was watching Sea Hunt that day, one day as a little boy, and Sea Hunt wasn't on that day because of the assassination. And I actually can remember people coming on the news and saying, Aldous Huxley also died today. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm missing Sea Hunt. Who the hell is Aldous Huxley? Like a 12 or 13-year-old boy. So this person, Walter Pankey, who by the way died in a scuba diving accident in Maine, he was like a 40-year-old brother. He was a medical doctor who was doing a a divinity degree at Harvard Divinity School. And he said, well, Aldous Huxley says these experiences on psychedelics are indistinguishable from genuine mystical experience. So he devised a study where he took the primary characteristics described in the literature of mystical experience, and formed questionnaires, gave psilocybin to a bunch of graduate students at Andover Newton, and made the argument, if we look at the way they filled out these questionnaires and described their session reports, even experts on mystical experience can't tell the difference between the two. I don't want to belabor that study, but it was the first scientific support for this theory of Huxley and Osmond. Okay, so it spilled very quickly beyond academia into the youth culture, primarily because of this guy, Timothy Leary. And, a lot of people think Timothy Leary was fired from Harvard for giving psychedelics to his students. Nope, that's actually not historically accurate. He was fired because he was so enthused by psychedelics that he stopped teaching his classes. He just stopped going to class. He became much more interested in turning on other intellectuals and especially artists, interestingly enough. So he's the person who gave LSD to Jack Kerouac and a lot of other people, Allen Ginsberg, for example. And when he started his campaign of spreading the peace and love, then so many people so quickly were having their minds opened, there was very little integration. Maybe that's a good way to put it. This happened. This happened. And when this happened, with so many people experiencing the unitive mystical experience, transcending their robot mind, their default mode network, that it terrified the mainstream. It threatened the status quo in profound ways. Karl Marx once said, those who benefit most from the status quo have the least motivation to change it. And so those in places of power were not up for a lot of this. And so this guy came along, Richard Nixon. He said Timothy Leary is the most dangerous man in America. Now I have to say, don't let me get up on my high horse, but he was sending thousands of young American men to Vietnam to die all the time. And Timothy Leary was the most dangerous man in America? I don't think so. I can see him though at home with, what was his wife's name? Yeah.
Why are all these people loving each other? We can't have all this love. They're all loving each other. Oh my God. This is terrifying. We've got to stop this love. Who's going to join the army now? Sorry, thanks for that. That was a therapeutic.
My draft number was 59. If I was out of college, I was getting a free ticket over. So that happened, and that triggered, I'm going to leave him up there just so I can hear him a little more. That was a joke. That's what caused the shutdown, right? That it was terrifying to mom and pop America, I suppose. And there was a 30-year shutdown starting in 1970. Psychedelics were not only illegal, but they were even illegal to use for scientific research. And that changed, and that's why I'm moving along a little faster here. Somebody give me the time. Keep going. Oh, good, we're doing good. Yeah. So in 2006, Roland Griffiths replicated the Good Friday experiment, and cutting to the chase, again, remember what the Good Friday experiment was about? This is Walter Pahnke,
I was talking about a little earlier, that you take a questionnaire, now it's called the MEQ 43. The Mystical Experience Questionnaire has 43 parameters that are embedded in the questionnaire are reference points from the traditional mystical literature about mystical experience. For instance, feelings of unity, feelings of ineffability. The experience was so profound, I can't describe it. I felt like the experience was beyond time and space. Okay? So different characteristics of this mystical experience. And with better controls than the original study by Pankey, what Roland Griffiths found was that people were having experiences indistinguishable from the mystical literature. And not only that, nearly 70% of all the test subjects said that it was one of their experience on psilocybin at Johns Hopkins was one of the 5 most important spiritual experiences of their whole life. And 1/3 of all test subjects said it was the most important spiritual experience of their entire life. And one of the requisites for these test subjects was that they had never ever tried a psychedelic before. Okay, so a profound result that has triggered a tremendous amount of interest. And integration, I want to say some things about because it's very important. We're talking about philosophical integration actually right now, which is saying that people like Aldous Huxley were trying to build a new worldview as a way for us to understand our relationship to the world as something more than what Alan Watts once called skin-encapsulated egos, right? That we're kind of trained to think of ourselves as isolated and separate from the world. What if we could build a worldview where we don't see ourselves in that way, right? A more integral, more holistic way. I wasn't planning on sharing this story with you, but I really feel compelled to. I was giving a talk at the Parliament of World Religions in 2014 in Salt Lake City. And a friend of mine told me that there was going to be this Kogi Native American from Colombia speaking there. And I've always been interested in this particular tribal group. Their shamans are called mamas. And one of the mamas was speaking. I said, I've got to hear this. And he was talking about integration of who we think we are with the world. Somebody asked him, what do you think the biggest challenge is for people in our culture? And through a translator, he was sitting all the time and they have this thing called a paporo, it's a kind of gourd. And he was fiddling with that the whole time, wearing rough spun cotton clothing, white clothing. Very small man, maybe this tall. And he said, he looked up very quickly at the audience and he said, you don't know who you are. You think that you're just your little body mind. And somebody said, you don't see it that way. And he said, I can cut off my hand and live. And he was sitting and he put his hand across his lap and he said, I can cut these off and I can live. And he reached out for a glass of water that was on the table and he said, but I can't cut myself off from this and live. So where does my body end? That's a very different way of looking at our relationship to reality. Huxley believed, and perennial philosophers today believe, and there's a range of perspectives. It's really a family of viewpoints rather than just one siloed view, that if we integrate properly the unitive mystical experience, we'll grow a new cultural worldview that is desperately needed today. That we are, I once began a philosophy class at Mecca by asking the students to write a paper on this
Question. Is going insane a sane reaction to an insane society? Write me an essay on that. That we need a new worldview. There's no doubt about that. And Huxley believed, I believed, that when that unit of mystical experiences had more and more, we're going to see more and more of what we're seeing this weekend. That if you go out and you look at what people are doing at those tables and booths, very often they're trying to find a way of incorporating a vision they've gained through psychedelics back into the culture again, to do something. Huston Smith always used to say, traits matter more than states. That states of consciousness are wonderful, and they can be flashy and they can be groovy, and isn't this fun? But traits of behavior matter more. That integration, we will know, has really taken place when we move from a place of simply celebrating the joy of the experience to constructing a new worldview and expressing a new worldview. In this new book, The Perennial Philosophy Reloaded, especially in the last chapters, I really tried to drill down on people today. On this idea that at the core you are the universe, you are nature, and what are you going to do about it? How are you going to express it? So I describe the work of some perennial philosophers today who are trying to do that. For instance, Father Richard Rohr self-identifies as a perennial philosopher based on the ideas of Aldous Huxley. And he works with the LGBT community. Rabbi Rami Shapiro, who I just got an email from today, whoops, Paul McCartney just got mad at me. He's very ill right now, but he's been doing a lot of work with people in recovery and believing that having more of these transpersonal experiences is beneficial to recovery and mental health. Mirabai Starr, how many people know who Mirabai Starr is? I'm just curious. Well, a few anyway. She works with people who have undergone trauma. She lost her 17-year-old daughter in a car accident. And it almost devastated her, but something in that trauma shook her into a broader view of her life. And so now she often works with people who are in trauma, not only to heal them of the trauma, but to see the growth potential that came out of the trauma. Anyway, I also talk about Stanislav Grof, who I'm sure a bunch of you have heard of, who says, in addition to psychedelics being very beneficial as tools of therapy for people struggling, they have tremendous value for healthy normals in the realm of self-actualization, as tools for self-actualization. So have the experience, integrate the experience, right? Have the experience, integrate the experience. States of consciousness are great, traits of behavior improved is also wonderful. I always used to say to students, so when you meet Morpheus, and he says, the red pill or the blue pill, take both. Take both. Transcend the matrix, but come back into it and help. Come back into this world and help. Thanks. Wonderful to talk with you. Wonderful. So there's the book, and there are postcards up here. If you'd like to have a postcard of the book, it comes out July 9th. It's already on Amazon for pre-orders, and there's the audio book, I think, is already out. Questions? I want to, what do you think? There's a question back there.
I don't have a question. I just want to say that was wonderful.
Oh. I mentioned Mirabai Star. I'm going to read to you, but I mentioned Mirabai Star. Here's a quote from her. She says, "When you turn your gaze toward the holy mystery once called God, the mystery follows you back out into the world." And I love that quote, and I left that out of my talk. Okay, you have a question?
Yes, I just want to say thank you for the lecture. I'm not still forward to reading your
Okay.
So, when Huxley wrote Brave New World, and with all the work he did on research on mysticism, he certainly embodied aspects of the beliefs of the counterculture revolution that happened during the 1960s. And when we compare that to somebody like Roland Griffiths, who has said that he was ready to quit Johns Hopkins and study meditation before he partook with the mushroom studies. And certainly most of the counterculture 60s people, if we were to lump Christianity in with mysticism as Huxley did, were coming from a place of having some sort of religious belief. And Huxley had studied mysticism for a long time. So if we contrast that with people like, I forget which Dallas brother was the head of the CIA during the MKUltra studies, he came from more of a whiskey-drinking, cigar-smoking, land-paving, Europe-bombing upbringing, and certainly the things that somebody like that did with access to large volumes of psychedelics. My question is basically, to what degree do you think that the people who took place in the 60s counterculture psychedelic revolutions and Huxley's experience during the Doors of Perception era was influenced by the fact that he was so well primed for a mystical experience and was already prone to interpreting the world through that lens?
I think very strongly. And it's often pointed out that that's a weakness of his position. I see it as a strength of his position. For instance, imagine there's a guy and he's got a rock, 5-pound rock around his neck. And he's forced by some evil god to carry this 5-pound rock. His name is Sisyphus, maybe. And he's going to carry this rock. And all the time he's like, oh, this is so terrible. I have to carry this rock. I have to carry this rock. And then somebody he meets says, hey man, that's a diamond. Do you realize that rock is a diamond? You're the richest guy on the planet. It's the same exact experience, hasn't changed a bit, but the interpretation changed. In the earlier part of that person's life, they had been trained to interpret it as a terrible experience. Some people interpret this experience of being alive right now as a terrible experience. So the predisposition, and if you, I guess one of the things I'm trying to say is that life confronts us like a Rorschach ink blot test. Being a person who studied philosophy their whole life, you just look at one philosopher after another trying to interpret the great mystery, the great mystery, the great mystery. Sometimes I feel like the only thing that a philosopher who gave us a new vision did was free us from the previous interpretation, frankly.
So that Huxley had an experience on psychedelics. He wasn't saying it was the only way to interpret it. He was saying it was a healthy way to interpret it. And that when I am having the experience, it's registering on its own, epistemically speaking, as profoundly real, profoundly valuable. Okay, now I have to come up with an interpretation of why I think it's real and why I think it's valuable. And so Huxley, just as you said, was reaching for those reference points. And that's what got passed on. So Alan Watts embraced Huxley's interpretation. If you read Watts' 1962 book, The Joyous Cosmology, if you read Timothy Leary's The Psychedelic Experience, they're praising Huxley's interpretation. So that just happened to be the one that came over to youth culture at that time. I mean, those books were on every hippie coffee table in America, you know. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, I have more questions, but.
Okay, well, yeah, we can grab a coffee sometime. Okay, yeah, there's a question back there.
Yeah.
I think I was trying to think very much in the historical record that in the 60s, when we Congress outlawed LSD and all the treatment, it kind of came down to like one or two representatives. Is that, did you have that knowledge of that? And I guess the follow-up question to that is, where would we be, big question, if we had not stopped all that promising research? We're getting back to that now, it feels like, is where we were 40, 60 years ago now?
Yeah, I mean, who knows where we would be. I think the most important thing to take away from your question is, we have another chance right now. We have another chance. In this second wave of enthusiasm for psychedelics as tools of self-actualization, we really have a chance to do it right. There's no, you don't make friends by terrifying them. So the mainstream culture has to be handled gently, and integration has to happen carefully. That's what I think is the most important part of that. Yeah.
Going kind of back to
And feel free, you won't disturb us if you have to go somewhere or you want to, and you still would like one of those cards. My wife is standing in the back, and she can give you one on your way.
going back to that statement you posited about is going insane a sane reaction to an insane world. Like, as time goes on, it's obviously very specific to people as they go through their life, but as like psychedelic or mystic experience, as you go through your life, if you find that becoming like flatter as you go on, like the illusion isn't there with it anymore, do you think there's any possibility that like as you see the world around you like dissolving or moving towards something that's more closer to an actual insanity, that like mystic experience actually becomes normal, feels more like a plane of reality that you want to return to, so it's not like this like world opening thing, but it's actually more of like a still and calmness?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Right? I don't know if you guys can hear the question. Well, basically, my answer will embed the question, so to speak, which is, if you're a person who feels like I'm going insane as a sane reaction to an insane society, that the more the unit of mystical experience comes online, and the more you center into that part of you that connects to being at a cosmic scale, I'll say, you start to trust that more. You start to trust that voice more. Oh, it's not me. I'm not the one who has to be talked into that I don't fit into this society. I need to find one I fit into, I need to help grow one that I fit into. Yeah. Ireland. Yeah.
But it has a description of how to use psychedelics as an initiation ceremony.
That's right. So not his deathbed, but a couple of years earlier, he wrote. So
Brave New World is his dystopian novel. Island is his utopian novel. And so in Island, not The Island, just Island, he's describing his idea of what a healthy, functional society would look like. And they call their psychedelic sacrament the moksha medicine, or the truth and beauty medicine. So anyway, that is definitely worth reading. If you want to read just one book by Aldous, I probably would recommend Island even over The Doors of Perception. It's quite an amazing book. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah.
I actually had a question about Island.
Okay.
Because at the end, it's almost like capitalism nothing.
Yes.
You know?
He makes a great point, which is there's an island called Paula, and the Paulinese are very, very cool. They're, I don't know, Burning Man on steroids. They're an interesting society. I'm being flipped. But what ends up happening is they have oil on their tropical island. And so a close-by island comes in with their military and conquers them to get the oil at the end of the book. Huxley lived through 2 world wars. He had a lot of his friends die in the First World War, so he had a tendency toward depression, and he fought cynicism his whole life. So even when he was writing a utopian novel, he wasn't completely convinced that society would go along with all that love. Should we have one more? One more question. Yeah.
I talked, by the way, I went for a walk on the Huxley station. I read the Perennial Philosophy and I read Aldous great stuff. My question was related to this. How do you combine like the Perennial Philosophy and the social change? Like in Island, the society describes as destroyed, made by oil company, if I remember. Maybe just how do you reconcile what's happening in Gaza right now?
For social change.
For social change.
Yeah.
How do you combine, how do you reconcile? Like in the 60s, they're like,
Yeah.
you're a political rally,
Yeah.
one end, you're mystics to the other.
Right.
How do you combine it?
Well, sorry, I have to rush this because we do have to leave the room. But I see it, first of all, in the book, I talk about that quite a lot. I break it down into chapters, and the last chapter has a lot to do with social integration. But on one level, it's almost as simple as this. If you think of society as a collection of individuals, which is what it is, right? A society is a collection of individuals. Then a society is only as intelligent, creative, imaginative, loving, grateful, compassionate as the individuals in the society hold those characteristics. You follow me? A forest is only as green as the individual trees in the forest are green. So as individuals self-actualize through their actions, you have social change. You know, there's the foundation of it, as I see it. Well, thanks again.